Reporting.
Awaiting orders. Ready and waiting. Awaiting Roger. Ready and waiting.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Reporting.
Roger. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Ready and waiting.
Roger.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Waiting order. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Knowledge. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Knowledge. Yes, sir. Knowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Right away, sir.
Yes, sir. Knowledge. Knowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir. Affirmative. You got it.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir.
Reporting.
Right away, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Yes, acknowledge.
Right away, sir. Roger.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. You got it.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, right away, sir. You got it. Right away, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Reporting.
Roger. 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 Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Yes,
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
ready and waiting. Got it.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Acknowledge.
Acknowledge. Yes, affirmative. Not a problem. Roger. Affirmative. Right away, sir. Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Yes, waiting orders.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Yes, affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Awaiting acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Yes. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Waiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Yes, affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Waiting.
Waiting.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Ready and waiting. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledge. Awaiting orders.
Yes,
Over and out. Affirmative. Over and out.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Ready and waiting.
You got it.
Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledge. Waiting orders. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
I'm a mechanical.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Report. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Yes.
Affirmative. Roger.
Yes. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Right away, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Awaiting knowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
I'm a mechanical.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Vehicle
Yes.
reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes. Waiting order. Yes. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledge.
Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting to acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Waiting for knowledge.
Yes, sir. Roger.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Affirmative. You got it. Affirmative.
Awaiting knowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledge.
Yes, Roger.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative. You got it. Right away,
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Awaiting order.
Waiting order. Roger.
Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Affirmative. Right away, sir. Affirmative. Right away, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Waiting orders.
Affirmative. You got it. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Affirmative. Right away, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Ready, yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Waiting for affirmative.
Reporting out. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Have
Affirmative.
arrived.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Mission accomplished.